Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're working on this Generac Ultra Source generator. It is rated at 17,500 watts. It is the largest portable that Generac makes. And my buddy Jason found this one on Facebook Marketplace for only $750, which is a great deal. Usually you can't find them for less than $1,000 unless they're complete junk. And the seller in the description of the listing said it only needs a battery and a new air filter. I guess there was a pretty big critter nest in here, so that filter was discarded, and there is some concern actually that some of that nest may have run through the engine. So we're gonna have to take a closer look at that and just make sure both cylinders are healthy. Anyway, Jason brought this home. He threw a new battery in it and tried to start it. And although the engine cranked, it showed no signs of life. So he tried it a few times unsuccessfully and then rolled it into the corner for about 2 months until he could get it over here for us to take a look at. And of course, the morning that he went to bring it to us, he tried starting it one last time, and to his surprise, it actually started. He said it didn't sound great, but it did run and make power. So, I would say best case scenario, we might just need to clean up the carb a little bit to get it running better. But of that, I am not sure, because he did start it for me once he brought it over, and there were a few things that seemed really off. I guess first off, there was an unusual amount of smoke coming from the exhaust when the engine was cranking, but when running, that went away. When running, it did surge occasionally, kind of misfired once in a while, and at times the engine speed seemed a little fast. So we might have issues with the fuel system. Potentially we have issues elsewhere. The other weird thing is that after we ran it, I parked it in the garage, and for 2 days after that, it smelled really bad. And not of bad fuel, like a mouse nest getting really hot. So there might be a critter nest somewhere in here that hasn't been cleaned out. Maybe the exhaust. That might be the reason for the smoke out of there. Either way, I think we're going to start a little bit backwards and just start the machine. Run it for a bit so you can see kind of the starting point. And then we'll bring it inside, fix it up, and then bring it back out for a load test. Yeah, let's just double check the oil before starting this. Yeah, it actually looks like it's overfilled. I mean, the machine isn't perfectly level, but it's not that unlevel to throw it off like that. Yeah, we are way overfilled. That we should be right to that mark. Instead, we're way up there. So it doesn't smell like fuel. But I've been burned before. So actually, before starting this, let's actually roll it in real quick where it's a little bit more level. We'll swap the oil out and then do a quick test. So to drain the oil, we just pull the plug here from the line. The issue is actually twofold. First, it's really slow to come out, but second, you can't actually walk away from it, or this thing's going to flip up and nothing's going to come out. So what I'm going to do is weight it down a bit and force it to stay straight. Maybe like that. So it looks like quite a bit of oil came out. You know, the capacity on this is 1.2 quarts without a filter change, but 1.5 with. And given that the filter's still installed, there should only be about 1.2 quarts here. So let's measure this out real quick before refilling the engine. All right, so right there is 1 quart, and it's pretty thin oil. So even though it doesn't smell like fuel, I'm guessing there has to be some in there. So let me pour this off. We'll finish measuring up the rest, see how much we had. And right there is 2 quarts. So yeah, way overfilled. We should have 1.5 total, including what's in the oil filter. And we still actually have some in the tray and the oil filter as well. So yeah, it was pretty overfilled. And let's get a new filter on here as well. All right, let's see how we made out here. And yeah, that's pretty good. The full mark is right there, and we're actually a touch above, which is fine. You know, the oil filter wasn't 100% full, so I think once we get the engine running and the oil circulating, that should be pretty much perfect. All right, so initially I'm going to crank it with the choke off. I want to see if that smoke comes out of the pipe again. Also, I've got a light plugged in as well as the kilowatt, but I don't think the GFCI is resetting. So I also have the breakout cord as well. So if things don't light up, we can move the plugs over to the breakout cord, which bypasses the GFCI, to see if we're making power. So let's just crank the engine for a minute without the choke. And no smoke, so that is a good thing. So let's turn the choke on. All right, so that was a pretty good test. You know, the engine started with choke without a whole lot of effort. You know, I didn't see any smoke while cranking, but once the engine started, it did let out a few plumes of smoke, but that quickly dissipated. So I don't think we have any issues there. Also, the light and the kilowatt came on, so the GFCIs seem to be in good order. As far as the engine goes, it was a pretty hard start. It was popping and backfiring out of the intake, and once it kind of worked through that, the engine was surging pretty bad. So for sure, you know, the fuel system needs to be cleaned up. The other thing is that debris started to fly out once the engine started to spin. There's a piece right there. We have another piece right here, which looks to be nesting material and part of the original filter that was actually pulled out and thrown away from the original owner. So we are going to have to pull the blower housing and make sure everything's clean in there as well. So let's get this back inside and get this thing cleaned up. So before we dig in and get, you know, the blower housing and the carb cleaned up, I actually want to drain the tank and get that out of the way. You know, there is a lot of fuel in there. I think it's been in there for quite some time. You know, although it doesn't smell bad yet, it's well on its way. So let's get that drained out, and then we'll shift gears to the carburetor and the blower housing. So we're just going to pull the line right here from the pump. The valve on the tank is off, but there is some fuel in here, so we're going to spill a bit. But once the line's off, I'm going to extend it down, and we're going to drain the first few into some clear containers just to see if there's any water or debris in the system. And we can also get a feel for kind of what the fuel quality is like. Anyway, you get the idea. This is going to take a while. I believe the tank has a 16-gallon capacity. So the good news is, although the fuel is clearly old, you know, it's not bad. There is no contamination, so this can be mixed up with some good fuel and burned in the car. So I think the first move here is to get this control panel at least loosened up. I'm not sure if we need to remove it completely, but I know we can't get this off with kind of this in the way. So there are some live wires coming up here from the battery, so I'm going to disconnect the battery first, and then we'll move over and get the control panel loose, and then go from there. And technically, we only need to remove one lead from the battery. Although, yeah, I was going to say, although I'm worried it might accidentally touch, but like that, we should be safe. Huh. That one didn't feel good. And same thing with that one. They're turning. They feel like they have thread locker, or maybe just cross-threaded. Can't tell. Kind of looks like rust. And we're in, kind of. I can just loosen up this bolt. The choke should slide out. Huh. Should. Actually, no, it doesn't slide out. You got to pull it out until it gets more narrow. Then you can lift it out. Like that. And we can unplug the fuel solenoid for the carb. And I believe, yeah, we can untwist this knob. As far as the wires go, we might get away with leaving them connected. I think once the knob is removed, we can pull this through and just kind of set it out of the way, although there is still one wire running to the servo. So the servo, I'm not sure we can disconnect the wires, but there's a bolt right there holding the bracket in place. So if we remove that, we also remove this ball and socket from the throttle. That should free it up, although, usually there's 2 bolts. Not sure if this one is 1 or 2. So let's do those 2 things and see if that frees up the servo. All right, that came off easy. So I'm just going to take this one all the way out. I did find the other bolt. I'm not sure we're actually going to be able to get to it, but it's kind of right on the other side there. And you can probably just see it. It's right there. Problem is, how do you get to it? Potentially this will do it. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, I'm not sure that did a whole lot for us. We can't actually slide it under the intake. There's just not enough space. So, potentially once the carb is removed, we can slide it under. Otherwise, I think we are going to have to remove the intake, but I'm trying to avoid that. I think if we can get this out of the way, the carb out of the way, I think the blower housing will come out with the intake in place. Yeah, getting access to the carb and the blower housing, it's a bit like trying to figure out a puzzle. But I think if we remove this bolt, and there's actually 4 crusty nuts here, that should theoretically allow the airbox to come out, and it should free up the carburetor. All right, let's see if these are going to come out. And let's see if we can get this off without destroying the gasket. I think there is also a breather likely connected to this air box from underneath. And it's hard to see, but the breather actually looks to be right there. So we can loosen that up, maybe get it off. There we go. Okay. Yeah, we actually can't do it this way. I think the only way is to take the manifold off because the oil dipstick tube is right in the way. And we need to slide this airbox back a good inch before it'll clear the studs. So there is actually no way to do this without pulling the whole manifold. Yeah, it just seems a little silly to have to do this to pull the carburetor. You know, instead of using studs, if they had used bolts, we could have just removed the bolts, and then both the airbox and the carburetor would have come out. So I think I'm actually going to backtrack a bit. You know, I did drain the tank, and it is kind of preventing, I wouldn't say easy access, but I think it would be a little better so that everyone can see a little better what's going on here. So I'm going to get the fuel line off, then the tank off, and then the manifold. So theoretically, we are free, although the seals haven't been broken yet on the intake pipe. So let's see if we can separate them without ripping them. All right, well, the servo's out. And we're hung up on one other piece here. There's actually like a rubber boot coming from the blower housing, which connects into the bottom of the carb, or the bottom of the airbox here. All right, that is free. Breather is still partially on. Okay, breather is fully off. And theoretically, that's it. That easy. Okay, so that actually opens up quite a bit of space up here on the top of the machine. And now we have actually very easy access to the blower housing. So to get that off, just a few bolts going around. We actually need to pull the oil cooler as well. So 2 bolts on each side that should pull away. And then the blower housing will come right off and we can get that nest, whatever remains of it, cleaned up. I think that's everything. I was going to say time for the big reveal and pull this off, but I've already found a tail and the little guy that made all the mess. So yeah, there was definitely a mouse in here. And surprisingly, not much left of the nest. I think most, if not all of it, blew out. So that is a good sign, but you can tell up here from the corrosion that, the mouse probably did that. So I'm just going to blow through the fins, make sure they're clear behind the flywheel. Sometimes nesting material gets behind there. But otherwise, things look pretty good in here. So we can just make sure everything's good, get the cover right back on. Yeah, so overall, the mouse didn't do a ton of damage in here other than kind of this area. But he did chew this wire. Actually, not the wire. The insulation seems okay there, but this is just the outer sleeve. So I don't think that's going to hurt anything leaving it like that. But since we're here, let's get maybe a little bit of tape around that to help keep it together. And we'll just get it unplugged from the coil so we can pull it out. Get a little bit better access to it. Yeah, I think we need just a bit more. That should be good. All right, so now that we have the intake off, it's going to be quite a bit easier to get things apart. So we'll get the air box off and set that aside. We're going to clean that up later. And the carburetor should slide right off the studs. And good, the gasket released without causing any damage. Let's get this choke out of the way. And we'll set that aside as well. So the carburetor, we know it runs the engine. Obviously, it has some issues. With these, majority of the time, it's actually the pilot jets that are under this screw. They get a little bit clogged up, and actually the O-rings degrade and kind of fall apart, and that creates an air leak. So I'm expecting that's going to be part of the issue here. So let's actually start with getting the pilot jets out. And that is pretty stuck in there, but it's coming out now. And these jets, they are essentially the same style that you would see on a Honda or a Honda clone, like on a GX390. And it's the same O-rings that you can replace it with. So we'll take a closer look at the O-rings in a second. And definitely kind of an odd fit with the fuel inlet right above the jet, but it just squeezes out. We'll set that aside. We'll come back to that. That pilot jet was fine. And so was that one. So neither was clogged. The O-rings, they're hard to see. They're actually black. This one actually doesn't feel too bad. It came off in one piece. Let's check the other. Yeah, and it came off in one piece as well. Doesn't feel quite as good as the other. It actually seems to be a little damaged. So that might have something to do with the run issue. We'll make sure we get some new O-rings on before reinstalling those jets. So let's get the carb back over here. And we'll drain out the fuel. And a little bit of debris in there, but not too bad. So we just have 3 Phillips screws here on the bottom holding the bowl on. And actually, we'll get the fuel solenoid off as well. And that came off pretty easily. And this should give us pretty good insight as far as what we're dealing with. If the pin's clean, then likely the carb isn't too bad. And yeah, pin actually looks halfway decent. So I expect the inside of the carb is going to look pretty much the same. Yeah, not too bad actually. A little bit of debris in the bowl, but bowl looks pretty good. Float feels fine. Let's get that pin out. Needle looks good. And then we're just left with 2 main jets. And that one does not want to come out. Let's try the other. No, both of those are pretty stuck. So I'm going to apply a little bit of heat to that. See if we can get those to move. Actually, let's try the impact first. I'm afraid to use a torch on here, at least at the moment, because there's still quite a bit of fuel around and in the carb. All right, that worked. Try the other side. Beautiful. All right, and that's it as far as the carb goes. Let's just check the main jets. That jet is clear. And yeah, both jets are clear. So I'm guessing the run issue was likely these O-rings. But we have it apart, and we do have a little bit of junk, so we'll get it cleaned up and bolted back on the machine. I'm going to try to get these seals out. The cleaner I use likes to shrink these a bit. So it'd be best not to run that through. And I'm just noticing too, the gasket, which I believe is OEM, not fitting very well on this intake manifold. So it is actually acting as a restriction, at least on the barrel on the left here. So I'm going to try to get this gasket off, maybe flip it around, see if we can make it fit somehow a little bit better. All right, that came off pretty well. Let's just flip it over. And it is different. You can see the spacing here versus here. It is different. Yeah, the fit, I mean, maybe a little better, but not really. Yeah, it just looks like the gasket's made wrong. So the right side is actually quite good. It's just the left side, it's got to go over a little bit more. And the fact that there's so much slop here too, when you bolt it down, you know, depending upon how you position it, kind of makes a difference as far as how good it fits. But yeah, that's a pretty bad fit. I think I can do better than that. All right, let's see how we made out. Yeah, not perfect, but there is no obstruction anymore, so I think this will do. There's still plenty of material left to form a seal, so I think we're okay as far as the gasket goes. So let's get this soaking for about 10 minutes. We'll get it back together and try it out. All right, so everything cleaned up really well, and it's ready to put together more or less. You know, we do need to get the new O-rings to replace the old. So these here, I actually got a bunch of them from a subscriber. You know, these should fit Honda clone pilot jets, and since this is a clone of the Honda clone jet, these should fit more or less perfect. So let's fit it and see how it feels. And yeah, that is a nice snug fit. So I think that is going to work out perfect. So we'll get the other one in and get that washer and bolt in place just to hold the jets down. And next we'll get the emulsion tubes in, as well as the main jets. All right, and then we'll get fuel solenoid installed. And lastly, the float. Okay, so let's get this fitted to the intake manifold and get the whole thing back on the machine. And I also ran the airbox through the cleaner. So we got most of the remnants of that nest out. Although before I get that on, we do have a gasket between the carb and the airbox. So the bolts that were on here, a little crusty. Actually not that bad, but I did find 4 new ones that are also serrated like the old ones that are brand new. So we're going to use those instead. And the serrated part will help these from spinning out. Because if they do spin out, likely they're going to get sucked right into the engine. Now on something like this, I usually torque carbs down to about 70 inch-pounds for something this size. But this airbox and this plastic piece right here, they don't have any metal bushing. And if you actually tighten it up to 60 or 70 inch-pounds, there's a good chance you're going to crack the plastic. I've done it before. So go very easy on this. Maybe 20 or 30 inch-pounds at most. And I'm just going to bring this up to 30 inch-pounds. Yeah, and even that's making me nervous. Let's try 20. It hasn't clicked yet. There we go. Okay, that's it. All right, so before we get this installed, there are still a few things we need to do. And I think the first thing is going to be to get this boot installed. Likely it'll be easier to do it now. And once the carb is in position, we're going to have to get this tucked properly into the blower housing. The other thing is the choke lever. All right, so that goes like that. And then lastly, the gaskets came off pretty clean, but not perfect. The one over here, it did lift a little bit just off the surface of the gasket. So what I'm going to do, at least on this side, is put just a very thin layer of gasket maker. I want to make sure, if the engine is still running lean, that we're dealing with a carb issue and not potentially an intake leak, although I don't think it would leak. It's better to be safe than sorry. And we don't need much. Just a very thin coating. Okay, that should do it. So let's get this back on the machine. And before we get everything bolted back in, we do have to position the servo where it needs to be, because we're not going to be able to get it there after the fact. The issue is this plate keeps pulling the servo out of place. So what I'm going to do is zip tie this right here. So that'll take the weight of the plate, give us a little bit of slack for the servo, and then we can get the carb bolted in place. So I'm going to place the servo right there for now. We need to get this in position, get the breather hooked up, or at least started, before we bolt this down. Actually, I think we can get the breather on after the fact. So I'm going to add one bolt to hold this in place. And let's see if we can get the breather on. I'm not sure if we can do it like this or if we have to pull it off again. Yeah, I think we need to pull it off. So I'm going to get this back out. I can't really get the breather on the way that it is right now. The problem is, ideally I'd put it on, as I'm putting this intake manifold on, I would just drop it in place. But due to the shape here of the blower housing, you can't lift this up. You can only slide it in. But to get the breather on, you really need to come down from the top. So, this is going to take a while. All right, change of plan. I'm going to take the airbox back off. These studs can actually unscrew from the manifold. So I'm thinking we should get the manifold on first, carburetor, then airbox. Something like that. A faster way to get these out is to double nut and basically tighten the nuts up against each other. Once you do that, they're going to grip the stud. And in theory, you can twist it out without having to use vice grips. And it looks like there is thread locker on these as well. So I'm not sure it's really necessary, but we might add a little bit back when we put this back together. Yeah, and that thread locker. And you do need the vice grips to break the thread locker grip. All right, so we've got the air intake boot as well as the breather in place. So now we need to slip the carb down there with the choke lever attached. And the fuel solenoid, going to be a little bit of an issue, but I think we're okay. All right, we're in position. So I'm actually going to set this down for a second. I need to get some thread locker back on these studs. Then we'll get them in with the gaskets and torque everything down. All right, so this is the tricky part here. We need to get the stud through the gasket, both on the airbox side as well as the engine side. And we'll get the new filter in place. It looks a little discolored because I did spray some foam filter oil on there. It is kind of red in color. So we'll get that secured. Probably going to leave the top of the airbox off for now until everything else is connected up. I guess while we're here and have good access, let's just start cleaning things up a bit. All right, so we're going to get the servo reinstalled. I've already started the bolt down here. The bracket is slotted so we can slide it in place. And then get the other bolt started. All right, so we need to get everything situated. Got to get the choke in place first. Like that. And I think, we should probably tighten up that nut. You might be able to do it after the fact. There is some space you could come in through the back, but I think we can get a wrench in there easier right now. So we're pretty much ready for contact, other than connecting up the battery and some fuel. And I'm going to run this off the external tank. And I'm hoping it's going to run well because getting the carb off takes a bit of time. And to be honest, the carb didn't look that bad, so I'm not convinced that it's going to run perfect, but hopefully it does. So I am going to add the airbox cover back on before we try this. Some carburetors, they are sensitive to the airbox and the air filter. If you don't have these in place, it's going to run a little bit more lean and it's more likely to surge. So since we've gone through the carb, we know it's clean. We now have a filter in place. I think if we add the cover on, that will tell us for sure if the issue is fixed. All right, so we are back together. We are plumbed into external fuel. So let's crank the engine, and with any luck, we can turn the choke off and not have the engine surge. All right, choke is on. I think we're looking pretty good here. The engine started with little effort. I was able to turn the choke off right away. And although the speed was a little bit unstable, it did work itself out in about 20 seconds, once some heat started to build up in the engine. So I think the carburetor is good to go. Yeah, when this generator is running, it seems noisier than normal, and I think it's the heat shield. There's a few spots where if you move it, it makes an unpleasant noise, and I think when the engine's running at 3,600 RPM, this is just oscillating super fast. So I'm not exactly sure where the noise is coming from, although I say that, and I think I know. Let's take a look around the corner. So it's actually the heat shield right here. It's contacting something back behind it. So I think if we deform it a little bit, now it's not making contact. So that should quiet the machine down, I would think, quite a bit. All right, so I think we're pretty much ready to go. I put about 5 gallons in the tank, and although that seems like a lot, it really didn't fill it up a whole lot. This machine consumes about 1.6 gallons every hour at half load, so it is very thirsty, but I think we have enough to do what we need to here. So I've got 2 loads hooked up. Got a 6,000 watt load over here, and the load bank is rated at 10,000 watts. Now, the odd thing about this machine is that the highest output is the 50 amp output, which is connected to the load bank. So that is limited to 12,000 watts, and to get the other 6,000, we had to connect up to the 30 amp output. So what that means is that if you have this connected to your house, the most you can get out of this is 12,000 watts with 1 cord. And you can't run 2 cords to the same transfer switch. So this machine may not be the best solution for home backup. It might be better for a job site. Anyway, I'm anxious to see what the THD is on this machine. So let's get the engine started. While it's warming up, we'll double check the output using the kilowatt to measure the voltage and the frequency. We use the amp probe to measure the total harmonic distortion, and the oscilloscope to see what the output looks like. If everything checks out, we'll put on about a 6,000 watt load. We'll give that some time. We'll then double it to 12,000 watts. If everything checks out, I'm going to bring it up to 16,000 watts, which is about a 90% load for this machine. All right, so the fuel's on, choke's on. The fuel pump, it is dry, so it might be a hard start. I think there is still fuel in the carb, so hopefully it'll start without too much issue. And for this one, I am wearing air protection because this machine is quite loud. I think my neighbor's gonna like this one. All right, so it started without issue. Engine speed is still a bit unstable. I'm hoping it's going to work itself out. The machine, it is a little loud still. I mean, not just the exhaust, but it seems like something is vibrating. So, yeah, hopefully we don't have any bigger issues here. Anyway, without a load, let's check the THD and the sine wave. This one, I'm not expecting to be low THD. And no, we're starting at around 5 or 6%, and the sine wave looks average. So let's put on a 6,000 watt load, and we'll give it some time, see how it does. All right, 6,000 watts, and the engine didn't even notice it. It actually quieted down a little bit. So yeah, something definitely vibrating, a bit of harmonics going on somewhere. And no issues at all with 6,000 watts. The engine speed is dead on perfect at 60 hertz. So that is the benefit of a servo. It should maintain perfect speed. So let's add another 6,000 watts. We'll double the load. So there's 8,000, 10,000, 12,000. No issues. And the THD, yeah, came up quite a bit to 24.6. And the sine wave does not look great. But the engine, it is running quite well under a 12,000 watt load. So we'll give this a few minutes, and then we'll bring it up to 16,000 watts. no issues at all at 12,000 watts. The engine speed at a perfect 60 hertz. So let's bring it up to 14,000, 15,000. Now we're at 16,000 kilowatts. So the engine, again, rock solid, steady. THD mostly unchanged at 25%, and the sine wave looks about the same. So yeah, not too bad. Let's take the load off, and we'll let things cool down, and then we'll shut it down. And actually, one feature this machine has too is the idle down. So we didn't touch the idle set screw, so theoretically it should work. We do have a 100-watt load on with that light, and actually the cooling fan, so it's probably not going to idle down. And actually, we need to give it a little more time before turning the fans off. So let's turn the light off now. And the cooling fans, they should be pulling about 200 watts, and likely that's too much for the idle to kick in. So yeah, another minute or two, and we'll try it out. And that feels pretty cool. Actually, I didn't turn the load fully off. I still have 500 watts on there. So let's turn that off. And the light's off, so here we go. The machine is idled down. Nice and low. Very nice. But I think I want to idle it back up so that we can run it out of fuel. So I'm going to turn the valve off. Turn the idle off, and we'll run it out of fuel. All right, guys, and that is pretty much it. Hopefully you could hear me while we were testing this, because this was a very loud generator. That vibration was louder than the engine, and even when it quieted down, things were still quite loud. So I would say this machine would be best run on a construction site. I don't think your neighbors would appreciate it too much if you ran it for any period of time. So yeah, thankfully we didn't run it for too long. But the performance, no issues at all. The engine started right up, had no issues at all at 16,000 watts, and the engine speed was rock solid steady, as well as the voltage throughout testing. So from that point of view, it performed very well. The auto idle also performed well. It idled down and quieted down. So yeah, definitely a good machine for the construction site. THD though was a little disappointing. We topped out at about 25%, which is fairly average for a portable generator. But, this is not your average machine. It is quite large. It costs a lot of money. And something this size you would like to hook up to your house. But given the dirty power and the fact you're limited to 12,000 watts, it's likely not the best choice to power your house. Anyway, the machine, it is done. It is back up and running like it should. So, I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.